They were not just movies, they were warnings hiding in plain sight. In the early 1930s, Hollywood believed it had no limits. Desire was shown without shame. Violence arrived without consequence. Power came without punishment. Then something shifted. They triggered fear inside the system itself. One by one, they pushed the boundaries too far until Hollywood was forced to face a truth it could no longer ignore. The rules were coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. Number 14, Madam Satan, 1930. Hollywood in the early 30s was chasing spectacle like a gambler chasing a final win. Then came a film that felt like a fever dream wrapped in silk and scandal. Madam Satan was not just ambitious, it was excessive in a way that made even seasoned audiences uncomfortable. Directed by Cecil B. DeMille, the film promised glamour and delivered chaos. Floating airships, masquerade costumes dripping with temptation, a marriage pushed into dangerous territory where identity and desire blurred beyond recognition. What followed was not applause. It was rejection. The film collapsed financially and left studios stunned by the scale of its failure. But the deeper damage came from the reaction outside theaters. Moral watchdogs began pointing fingers at Hollywood's growing obsession with indulgence. The industry suddenly looked reckless. Studios realized they were no longer in control of how far they could go. Madam Satan became an early warning that excess without restraint would not just fail at the box office. It would invite a crackdown that Hollywood was not prepared for. Number 13. The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. There are films that entertain. Then there are films that disturb in a way that lingers long after the screen fades to black. The Story of Temple Drake did not ask for permission to cross lines. It stepped over them with a cold certainty that shocked audiences. The story followed a young woman pulled into a nightmare of violence and control. There was no safety net, no comforting resolution, only a descent into something painfully real. The backlash was immediate and relentless. Censorship boards reacted with alarm, and several regions moved to ban the film outright. Religious groups seized on it as proof that Hollywood had lost its moral compass. This was no longer about one controversial release. It was about the growing belief that films were pushing society toward something dangerous. Studios began to feel the pressure closing in. The Story of Temple Drake did more than provoke outrage. It exposed how fragile Hollywood's freedom had become and how quickly it could be taken away. Number 12, Island of Lost Souls, 1932. There was something deeply unsettling about the way this film looked at science. It did not celebrate discovery. It exposed obsession. Island of Lost Souls took a familiar idea and twisted it into something that felt almost forbidden to watch. A remote island, a scientist who refused to accept limits, creatures that existed in a space between human and animal. The film did not rely on suggestion. It showed enough to make audiences uneasy and then let their imagination do the rest. What truly shook viewers was not the visuals alone. It was the implication that man could play God and reshape life without consequence. Religious groups reacted with anger. Many countries banned the film outright. Even within Hollywood, there was growing concern that this kind of storytelling was pushing too far into territory that would provoke a larger backlash. The fear was no longer hypothetical. It was real and spreading. Studios began to understand something critical. Shock could draw attention, but it could also invite control. Island of Lost Souls became a powerful example of how horror and science, when combined without restraint, could cross a line that audiences were not ready to accept. And once that line was crossed, it could not be easily undone. Number 11, Freaks, 1932. Some films fail quietly, or others explode on impact and leave scars behind. Freaks was the kind of film that did both at once. Directed by Todd Browning, it was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. Real circus performers were placed at the center of the story, not as background figures, but as human beings with emotions, alliances, and revenge. The intention may have been empathy, but the reaction was something far more complicated. Audiences recoiled. The imagery felt too raw, too real, too close to something they were not prepared to confront. Many theaters pulled the film early. Critics attacked it without hesitation. What should have been a bold artistic statement turned into a financial disaster that shook the studio system. The film was cut down heavily in an attempt to soften the blow, but the damage was already done. Inside Hollywood, the message spread quickly. There were limits to what audiences would accept, and those limits were not clearly defined. Freaks did not just fail, it frightened the industry itself. If a film could provoke this level of rejection, then stricter control was inevitable. The freedom of the pre-code era suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Number 10. The Kiss Before the Mirror, 1933. Sometimes a film pushes boundaries, not by amplifying what's seen, but by what is suggested. The Kiss Before the Mirror dared to challenge the sanctity of marriage and the complexity of morality in a way few films had at the time. Directed by James Whale, the film follows a gripping tale of jealousy, betrayal, and murder, all wrapped in a visually seductive narrative. At the heart of it is the conflict between trust and doubt, played out against a backdrop of a turbulent marriage. Audiences in 1933 weren't prepared for the depths the film delved into. The portrayal of a woman falsely accused of infidelity explored the murky waters of justice and the consequences of blind suspicion. It exposed the fragility of marital bonds and societal perceptions of women's roles, an unsettling exploration that rubbed against the grain of traditional values. The public's reaction was one of discomfort and unease. Critics of the film at the time believed that the story did not only threaten the moral fiber of society, it questioned the very institution of marriage itself. The film was banned in several regions and cut down for its theatrical release. What followed was a profound shift in the way Hollywood approached love and marriage on screen, marking The Kiss Before the Mirror as an early harbinger of a time when the boundaries of decency would no longer be so easily ignored. Number 9. Babyface, 1933. Power rarely looks this direct on screen. Babyface did not hide behind metaphor. It told the story of a woman who understood exactly how the world worked and chose to exploit it without hesitation. Played with striking control by Barbara Stanwyck, the central character rises through a corporate empire by manipulating the desires of the men around her. There is no apology in her actions, no attempt to soften the edges, only ambition moving forward with precision. What unsettled audiences was not just the subject matter, it was the absence of punishment. The film refused to deliver the moral balance that viewers had come to expect. This alone was enough to trigger outrage. Censors demanded cuts. Several regions banned the original version entirely, forcing the studio to create a revised ending that felt safer and more acceptable. Inside Hollywood, the reaction was immediate. This was a clear sign that audiences and watchdog groups were no longer willing to tolerate narratives where morality was optional. Babyface exposed a growing tension between storytelling freedom and public expectation. It showed that even a successful film could become a liability if it crossed certain invisible lines. And those lines were about to become very real, very soon. Number 8. The Sign of the Cross, 1932. Spectacle can seduce an audience. It can also betray a filmmaker when it crosses into territory that feels dangerous. The Sign of the Cross was designed as a grand religious epic. Directed by Cecil B. DeMille, it blended faith with visual excess in a way that few films had dared before. The story moved through ancient Rome with intensity, but it was the imagery that captured attention. Lavish parties, sensual dances, moments that lingered just long enough to spark discomfort rather than admiration. Viewers did not know how to process it. Was it devotion or temptation dressed as devotion? That question alone created tension outside the theater walls. Religious organizations began to protest loudly, arguing that sacred themes were being exploited for shock value. The film did earn attention and revenue, yet it also carried something far more damaging: suspicion. Within the industry, this reaction created unease. If even a religious narrative could trigger outrage, then nothing felt safe anymore. Studios began to recognize that the line between art and offense had become dangerously thin. The Sign of the Cross became part of a growing list of films that proved one thing clearly. Audiences were no longer reacting only as viewers. They were responding as guardians of morality. And that shift meant the freedom of pre-code Hollywood was beginning to collapse under its own ambition. Number 7. Tarzan and His Mate, 1934. Adventure films were supposed to feel wild, yet harmless. Tarzan and His Mate changed that expectation in a way that caught the industry off guard. At first glance, it looked like a continuation of a popular series. Jungle landscapes, danger, romance between Tarzan and Jane. But beneath that familiar surface, the film carried an energy that felt far less controlled. There was a physical freedom in the performances that audiences had not seen before. It felt natural, yet it also felt exposed. One sequence in particular became the center of controversy. An underwater swimming scene presented the human body with a level of openness that crossed the boundaries many believed should remain untouched. It was not framed as scandal. It was presented as beauty. That difference made it even more unsettling to critics and censors. The reaction was swift. Complaints intensified. Demands for stricter oversight grew louder. When enforcement of the Hays Code became unavoidable, scenes like this were among the first to be targeted and removed. For Hollywood, this film marked a turning point. It showed that even subtle expressions of freedom could ignite backlash. The industry realized it was no longer about how far they could go. It was about how quickly they would be forced to step back. Number 6. Ecstasy, 1933. The silence can sometimes be louder than dialogue, and Ecstasy understood that with unsettling precision. The film did not rely on sensational language or exaggerated drama. Instead, it presented intimacy and desire with a calm directness that audiences were not prepared to confront. At its center was a young woman, played by Hedy Lamarr, whose emotional and physical awakening unfolded without judgment and without apology. What made it so disruptive was not just what it showed, but how it showed it. The camera lingered. The emotion felt genuine. There was no moral filter guiding the viewer toward a safe conclusion. Reactions spread quickly across borders. Some audiences were fascinated while others were outraged. Government stepped in and banned the film outright. Critics labeled it dangerous not because it was chaotic, but because it was controlled. It suggested that human desire could exist outside the rules society had carefully built. That idea alone was enough to trigger fear among those already pushing for stricter control over cinema. Inside Hollywood, the message was unmistakable. If a film made outside the system could provoke this level of response, then the industry itself was walking a very thin line. Ecstasy did not need loud controversy to make its impact. Its quiet confidence exposed how fragile the balance had become. It showed that even a restrained film could force a global reaction, and that realization pushed studios closer to accepting that regulation was no longer avoidable. Number 5. Three on a Match, 1932. These stories about downfall were not new to early cinema, but Three on a Match approached the idea with a sharp honesty that felt almost confrontational. The film followed three women whose lives drifted apart as ambition, temptation, and circumstance pulled them in different directions. At first, it seemed like a familiar drama. Then, it began to peel back layers that audiences were not used to seeing so directly. Addiction, crime, and moral collapse were not hinted at. They were placed in full view without comfort or distance. What made the film particularly unsettling was its pacing. The descent happened quickly and without the kind of narrative cushioning that softened similar stories. Characters made choices that felt real and irreversible. There was no clear lesson guiding the audience toward redemption. Instead, there was a sense that consequences arrived without warning and without mercy. This realism created tension not just among viewers, but among those monitoring the cultural influence of film. Public reaction was intense. Critics debated whether such portrayals were responsible. Advocacy groups argued that showing vice so openly risked normalizing it. Within the studio system, concern began to grow that films like this were feeding a perception that Hollywood was promoting instability rather than storytelling. Three on a Match did not collapse in obscurity. It lingered in discussion. It became part of a larger argument about what cinema should show and what it should avoid. And that argument was rapidly turning into policy. Number 4, Employees' Entrance, 1933. Power inside corporate America had rarely been shown with such cold precision. Employees' Entrance did not romanticize success. It dissected it. At the center stood a ruthless department store manager played by Warren William, a man who viewed people as tools rather than human beings. Every decision he made carried weight, but none carried compassion. The film stripped away illusion and exposed a workplace driven by fear, manipulation, and control. What made audiences uneasy was not the ambition. It was the method. Women were exploited without hesitation. Careers were traded for survival. Authority became a weapon used behind closed doors where morality had no place. The film refused to punish its central figure in a way that felt satisfying. Instead, it presented a system where success often meant stepping over others without consequence. That lack of justice became the real provocation. Public reaction built slowly but steadily. Critics began questioning whether films like this were normalizing behavior that should be condemned. Advocacy groups pointed to it as evidence that Hollywood was drifting away from responsibility. Inside the industry, executives started to feel pressure from multiple directions. Financial success no longer guaranteed safety if the content itself triggered discomfort at a societal level. Employees' entrance forced studios to confront an uncomfortable reality. Stories rooted in realism could be more dangerous than fantasy. When audiences recognized truth in what they saw, the reaction became personal. And when it became personal, it demanded control. That realization pushed Hollywood closer to accepting limits it had spent years resisting. Number 3. Murders in the Zoo, 1933. Horror had always relied on fear, but Murders in the Zoo transformed fear into something more visceral. It did not hide behind shadows. It presented cruelty in a way that felt immediate and disturbingly creative. The story followed a man whose obsession with control extended beyond relationships into acts of calculated violence. What set the film apart was not just the presence of danger, it was the detail with which that danger unfolded. Audiences were not prepared for what they saw. Early scenes established a tone that felt almost shocking in its directness. Violence was not implied. It was demonstrated with an intensity that lingered in the mind long after the film ended. Critics reacted with alarm. Many described the experience as excessive, even by the standards of the time. The film quickly became a focal point in discussions about how far horror should be allowed to go. Outside the industry, the response grew louder. Moral watchdogs argued that such imagery could desensitize viewers and erode social boundaries. Calls for regulation intensified as films like this continued to test limits without clear restraint. Within studios, the concern was no longer theoretical. It was practical. If audiences rejected this level of brutality and external pressure increased, then financial stability itself could be threatened. Murders in the Zoo did more than shock viewers. It revealed how thin the line had become between entertainment and outrage. Once that line was crossed repeatedly, the consequences were no longer optional. They were inevitable. Number 2. Dr. X, 1932. Fear often hides in the dark. Dr. X dragged it into the light and forced audiences to confront something far more disturbing than simple horror. This was not just a mystery about a killer, it was a story about science stepping beyond control and losing its grip on humanity. Directed by Michael Curtis, the film blended crime and grotesque experimentation into a narrative that felt uncomfortably real for its time. What unsettled viewers was not just the concept, it was the atmosphere. Laboratories filled with strange devices, experiments that hinted at cannibalism, a sense that knowledge itself had become dangerous. The film created tension by suggesting that intelligence without restraint could lead to something monstrous. That idea resonated far beyond the screen. Audiences reacted with fascination and discomfort in equal measure. Critics questioned whether such imagery pushed boundaries too far into territory that could disturb rather than entertain. Outside the industry, voices grew louder. If films continued to explore these extremes, then public trust could erode completely. The concern was no longer about a single genre, it was about the direction of cinema itself. Within Hollywood, Dr. X became part of a growing realization. Innovation alone was not enough. Without limits, innovation could provoke backlash strong enough to reshape the entire system. The film did not collapse, but it contributed to a climate where control began to feel necessary. And once that idea took hold, the freedom of the pre-code era began to fade. Number 1. Scarface, 1932. Violence had appeared on screen before, but never with this kind of confidence. Scarface did not treat crime as a warning. It treated it as a rise. Directed by Howard Hawks and produced under the shadow of controversy from the beginning, the film followed a gangster who carved his way to power with relentless ambition. It was bold, unapologetic, and dangerously charismatic. Audiences were captivated yet unsettled. The central figure did not fade into failure quickly enough to satisfy moral expectations. His rise felt too thrilling, his presence too commanding. Critics and censorship boards reacted immediately, demanding changes that would reinforce consequences and reduce the sense of glorification. Even after edits, the tension remained. Outside Hollywood, the backlash intensified. Civic groups argued that films like this were influencing real-world behavior. The connection between cinema and society became the center of a growing storm. Studios could no longer ignore it. The pressure to implement stronger oversight reached a breaking point as more voices demanded accountability. Scarface became the final signal that the industry could not continue unchecked. It was not just a film, it was a catalyst, a moment where entertainment collided with responsibility and forced a decision. That decision reshaped Hollywood forever. The era of unchecked storytelling closed and a new system of control took its place. The freedom of pre-code Hollywood did not end with a single decision. It ended with pressure that kept building until resistance became impossible. These films crossed lines that audiences were not ready to accept and the industry could no longer defend. What followed was control that shaped storytelling for decades. But here's the question that still lingers. Did Hollywood lose its innocence or did it lose its courage?